Welcome, everyone, to The Citizen Speaks, powered by the Fitler Club. I'm Larry Platt, the co-founder of the Philadelphia Citizen, and I'm really excited about tonight. I think our guest, Jill Filopovic, has written one of the most important books of the last year, and we're going to talk to her in depth about it. Before we get to Jill, I saw a monologue on HBO last week that had me laughing and crying at the same time and thinking about Jill. So I thought it would be a good idea to listen to the very funny Bill Maher's screed from last Friday night, and then we'll respond to it on the other side. So for a guy who smokes a lot of dope, Bill Maher is awfully angry. But Jill, I thought of you immediately during all that. So, and you have this lovely phrase for what we just witnessed. Go ahead and rebut Bill Maher.
Sure. So in the book, I call monologues like that part of the boomer outrage industrial complex that you usually see more in conservative media, but is this effort to really whip up particularly conservative boomers against young people for whom millennial is now this kind of catch-all term. The idea being that young people with all of our new ideas are ruining America. You know what Bill Maher touches on, and I do think has a nugget of truth to it, right? Which is that a lot of older folks and a lot of baby boomers do feel like, you know, the discourse around okay boomer and age unfairly maligns them and unfairly shunts them aside. And I think that's a completely fair line of pushback. Ageism is a real thing. I understand the frustration. Where I get frustrated watching a monologue like Bill Maher's is, you know, I'm thinking, well, okay, you're frustrated that we complain about you guys. We're frustrated that you still control everything. You know, boomers have been a majority of Congress for years now. We've had boomer presidents since 1992, right? Bill Clinton was the first boomer president. Every president since Bill Clinton has been a baby boomer, right up until Joe Biden, who's a member of the silent generation, right? So this idea that boomers are being pushed aside, you know, when you look at who's in charge of American companies, when you look at who is at the helm of our magazines, our newspapers, our literary agencies, our movie studios, who's telling the stories, deciding which stories get told about America, when you look at who's at the helm of our political and other cultural institutions, it's not 100% baby boomers, but it's disproportionately baby boomers. And of course, you would expect there would be fewer young people in those vaunted roles. But I think what we often forget is that millennials aren't that young anymore. You know, the oldest millennials are 40, right? And the youngest ones are now in their mid 20s. One thing I looked at is actually after the book came out was when boomers were roughly in the same age bracket that millennials are now. So from mid 20s to roughly 40. What was their political representation like? And what I found is that a lot of the boomer politicians that are, you know, have been very relevant, people like Al Gore, people like, I believe, Rick Santorum, they entered the Senate when they were in their 30s. Millennials just got our first senator in John Ossoff in January. So we're way behind where boomers were, even when they were our age. So you can't really write this all off to, well, young people just need to pay their dues. We have, and we're still not being elevated to the same positions that boomers were in when they were roughly our age.
Yeah, you make a great point. And I realize it's a great point you make about Joe Biden not even being a boomer, but he was elected to the Senate at 29 years old. And so break down for me what this is really about, because for to some level, this has every generation disdains the one behind it, and every generation pokes fun at the one in front of it, right? In the 60s, it was don't trust anyone over 30. In Bye Bye Birdie, Paul Lynde was wringing his hands about these kids today. But this actually feels like something different or more profound? What is it? Why is that? What's the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, like you say, this is new and it's not, right? This kind of generational frustration with the young people thinking the old people are too conservative, and the old people thinking the young people, need to get off of their lawn. So it has ever been, right? That part of it is not new. I think what is new with the tension between boomers and millennials is a few things. There's first of all the fact that there are actually these really close interpersonal relationships between boomers and millennials. Not all millennials have boomer parents, but a lot of us do. A lot of us have really close personal relationships with our parents, right? Probably closer, frankly, than a lot of boomers had with their parents. And so you have this dynamic where there is this generational tension, but there's also this like not my boomer, not my millennial dynamic to it, right? We think our boomer parents are great. Our boomer parents think their millennial kids are wonderful. It's the rest, it's everyone else. That's the problem. So that to me that strikes me as a sort of interesting and distinct tension. There's also what we touched on right at the beginning, which is that particularly, I think the sort of boomer resentment of millennials has been politicized and weaponized by conservative media to really froth up the conservative half of the boomer generation against young people generally and millennials specifically. I think one thing we often miss in these conversations, and where a lot of boomers who I would guess are tuned into events like this one, I know get very frustrated, is by casting all boomers as conservative. And that's not true. Boomers are a more conservative generation than millennials are. Millennials are like overwhelmingly liberal. But boomers are really split down the middle. So you have this conservative half of the generation that has really owned politics. Who helped to usher Ronald Reagan into office, for example, who helped to usher Donald Trump into office, who have really fundamentally shaped America as we know it, politically and policy wise. But then you have this progressive half of the boomer generation who have had a huge cultural influence on the US, right? Often in opposition to this conservative half. And so I think often when boomers hear themselves being spoken about, especially the liberal ones, they don't always recognize what's being described, right? Or it doesn't feel reflective of who they are. But that said, I think millennials, are able to look around and see the political influence of boomers, what it has meant for our lives, the position it's left us in. And, I do think that kind of understandably makes us resentful, given that we are the first generation in American history that's going to do worse than our parents and probably worse than our grandparents.
And you present data to back that up, and it's also in your personal story in a way, because you talk about. I always look at these sort of cultural touchstones to generations. Every generation is tested in some way, right? The greatest generation had the Depression and World War II. Boomers, or at least one end of them, had Vietnam. You point out that millennials had sort of two major traumas, uh, and and speak to the effect that both 9/11 and the Great Recession had, that fuels the sort of mindset that you're talking about.
Yeah, now we're having a third, right? Which is
Good point.
the pandemic that we're all in, which is impacting millennials really specifically. So, 9/11 happened as the oldest millennials were kind of just entering adulthood. And as the younger ones were, in high school, middle school. Um, and that sort of immediately propelled us into an adulthood that was shaped by these forever wars, right? So I was a college freshman in New York when 9/11 happened, which means that for my entire adult life, the US has been engaged in conflict in the Middle East, right? So that has very much shaped, I think, the political perspectives, understanding, sense of security that a lot of millennials have. Um, a few years later, as millennials were graduating from college, as I was graduating from law school, we got hit with the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008. And so that really meant that millennials either didn't get hired If they had been hired, we're the first ones to get fired. And when we were looking for jobs, kind of were more willing to accept scraps and often started out at a lower compensation rate, including pay, but also things like retirement accounts and those sort of other benefits that had typically accrued for previous generations that many millennials didn't have access to. Um, we were entering the job market during the Great Recession as the most educated generation in American history, right? Which on its face sounds like a good thing, but those diplomas came with the highest levels of student loan debt in American history. And so then unable to get jobs, all these things are multi-layered, but you add on top of that the fact that millennials are also the most racially diverse generation, adult generation in American history. Gen Z, who are not all adults, are more racially diverse still. So you add on to that things like discrimination in the workplace, gender discrimination, racial discrimination in both hiring and pay, and the kind of jobs that folks are funneled into. And what you get is a huge generation-wide economic disaster. So Gen Xers were actually hit worse by the 2008 recession than millennials were. They took a bigger initial hit. But when you look at recovery data, Gen Xers recovered much faster and fuller. Millennials still haven't recovered, right? So economists essentially predict that millennials are never going to recover from that recession. We will never make as much money as we would have made, be as financially stable as we would have been had that not happened. And now we've just been hit with a pandemic that obviously has impacted everyone, but has again impacted millennials worst of all. For a few reasons. The jobs that millennials tend to be disproportionately clustered in were the ones that were hit very badly. And we know that this has been a pandemic that financially has really wiped out women and has wiped out mothers of children under 18 in particular. And most mothers of children under 18 in the US right now are millennials. So we've gotten badly knocked kind of from all sides, and then also at kind of every stage of adult life. And so I'm certainly hopeful that there will be some recovery, that we will wind up as stable older adults. But a lot of the numbers are not pointing in that direction.
Well, what's fascinating to me is the story you just told gives the lie to something that we've all believed, and maybe it's been promulgated by boomer propaganda, but we've all believed that the key to a vibrant, egalitarian, uh, aspirational economy is education. That if you are educated, you can write your own ticket. And what you've just outlined, and what you outlined so persuasively in the book, is not so fast, actually. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's right. Education is phenomenally, hugely important, but education as kind of the only path to the middle class, if you let the bottom drop out of the working class, is not a functional plan for society-wide success. And I think one of the things that we see in the millennial story is the degree to which you can't separate out how well the bottom is doing from how well the middle and the top are doing. And millennials came of age in a period of rapidly expanding income inequality. More of us, as I mentioned, have went to college than ever before. More of us graduated, many of us didn't, and still took on tremendous amounts of student loan debt, which is kind of folks who are in the worst possible situation. But what we've seen is that when boomers were young, when boomers were going to college, a college degree was a step up the ladder, right? It meant that you were going to do better than your parents did. For millennials, a college degree is kind of like the new high school diploma. It's the thing that you need to just maintain like your grip on that middle class rung. And the reason that's happened is not because college degrees are necessarily less valuable. It's because the bottom has gotten much lower. Wages have stagnated. It is very, very hard to be a person without a college degree, especially a woman without a college degree, and make the kind of money that can support a family and a middle class lifestyle. Like that era of America seems to have ended. that has huge effects for everybody, right? Not just the folks who are suffering from the bottom falling out of the working class, but also from folks who heard that a college degree was their ticket into the middle class and then took out huge amounts of student loan debt in order to pay for that. And then find themselves just kind of stuck and not actually moving up the ladder the way that they were promised. And that's the story of a lot of millennials. So as we're looking for solutions here, education is very important. Having a higher education that is affordable and accessible is hugely, hugely important. But unless we also do something about expanding income inequality, right? Unless we do something to shrink that gap between the poorest and the richest, and unless we do something to really bring the bottom up, we're just not going to achieve the kind of stability that boomers enjoyed and that millennials are really lacking.
Well, I'd be remiss if I don't ask you about, related to that, the elephant in the room, which is socialism. And Maher touched on it, but I think it's much more complicated because, and I struggle with this, and maybe you can elucidate me. It's also true. Maher is right that in surveys, millennials are more inclined to identify as socialists or as socialist adjacent. But it's also true that millennials and Gen Zers certainly have driven the capitalism for good movement. That B Corps, the rise of B Corps and social impact ventures, comes out of the demand as consumers from millennials to do business with companies that share their values. So which is it? Is the millennial generation socialist or rethinking what capitalism could be?
So I think we're both. And I'll bet the millennials that are want to invest in social good and the millennials that are going to DSA meetings are probably not like best friends, right? I guess that there's some tension there intergenerationally. But I think the overarching theme that drives both of those impulses is that millennials, we are a progressive generation, and we're a generation that wants to do good. I mean, we get made fun of a bit for being special snowflakes who all want participation trophies. But I think in reality, what that reflects is a generation of people that just really want to be decent, right? And want to help others out, want to make sure that people feel heard and seen and included. It's our boomer parents who gave us those trophies. So I'm not sure you can blame us for the outcome.
Right, you make that point that's also a response to Maher, right? I mean, Maher is complaining, but it's his generation that created the things he's complaining about.
Right, exactly. So boomer parents, I think, taught us to be kind, and how that ends up being expressed, whether millennials who did not grow up doing nuclear bomb drills the way our boomer parents did, right, have a really different perception of socialism than perhaps they did. We have the internet, and we can Google what's life like in Stockholm, and like, that looks pretty good, right? And so for us, that may be more reflective of what we think of as democratic socialism, right? A socialism that is still compatible with free and fair democracies. And doesn't carry the same baggage that word perhaps carried for our parents. I'm not sure that that's such a bad thing.
Well, and that's a great segue to welcome Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson. I'm so excited to have you with us. The average age on Philadelphia City Council before Councilmember Richardson ran, along with Isaiah Thomas, they're both roughly 37, I want to say, was 62, I think, and they've both brought the age down. But welcome, Councilwoman, and tell us a little bit. What I love about your story is that, let me put it to you as a question. How many times before you ran were you told to wait your turn?
First, I want to thank you, Larry, and to the Philadelphia Citizen and Jill for all your work and for your book, because it's so on point. As a millennial in Philadelphia, we all know Philadelphia, was told to wait my turn for everything. And when I decided to run for city council, if I had $1 for every time I heard, she's too young, she's not ready, but she has children, she shouldn't run. Not right now. Consider next term. Maybe next time. Wait 4 more years. Your children will be older. You'll be a little older. You'll have more understanding, and then you can run. I heard that probably a million times, but still decided to run because I recognize in part that we had no millennial representation on Philadelphia City Council at all ever before. So Councilmember Isaiah Thomas and I were the first millennials to ever serve on Philadelphia City Council. And for me, I think it helps us to bring a unique perspective around some of the issues that you already mentioned, Jill, from student loan debt to income inequality to our inability to pursue the quote unquote American dream in the same way that our parents and grandparents were able to do, in sort of working class, middle class communities. So, I'm appreciative that we're able to serve and highlight those real issues that we're all facing. But if I had $1 for every time I heard that, Larry, I would be a millionaire.
and then you wouldn't have to run, or you could at least buy your seat. Let me ask you this. I just got a press release from your office a couple of weeks ago, and I read it and I thought, oh, there's a perfect example of how a generational mindset informs legislation, or in this case, it was something that the Board of Pensions did in response to a suggestion or a stipulation that you put forth. Do you know what I'm referring to? And can you explain?
Yes, I do. Yes, we worked on that for 8 months. So it's to the point that Jill made around our value system as millennials and us wanting to support businesses and organizations that align with our values. So we approached the pension board to ask them to use an environmental social governance policy as it relates to climate change and investing in for our pension board. So for instance, our pension board can set policy around climate change with the organizations that we use to our city money and city dollars to invest in. So we've asked them to come up with this environmental social governance criteria for all of these organizations that's holding billions and billions of our dollars before we move forward with them. So it's all around ensuring that as we look at climate change and its impact not only on our built environment, but our environment as a whole, that we are being conscious of that in the investment decisions we're making as a city, and particularly for our pension fund. So we worked on it for 8 months. We worked with the staff and with the entire board of the pension board, and we're able to have the resolution pass, but also work with the pension board for them to adopt the criteria as a part of their investment strategy.
Jill, do you see that as generationally different? The way I reacted to that is the politicians that I know and have known for years will pass a recycling program, but not think holistically about the issue in this way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is very reflective of millennial priorities, right? To think a little more creatively about how we can fold in our ideals to almost everything we do. I mean, we see it in the kind of jobs millennials want, right? Huge numbers of millennials, and I don't have the exact survey on me right now, but will say they would take a pay cut to work at a company where they really supported its values, right? And whenever I quote that, like every millennial nods along, like, yeah, of course they would, right? But boomers don't have the same mentality. It's funny to me that this is about pensions, because I don't know a single millennial that ever plans on collecting a pension. But I think it is very cool, and I think it is also very reflective of, as you say, a generational difference, that's how millennial members of the city council are thinking about these decisions.
Councilwoman, do you have any other thoughts about or examples of ways that you're trying to change the narrative?
I think, for the first time, and this is one thing that we're especially proud of because this has never happened in such a robust way. To Jill's point about how we think differently, and to your point around how we want to do things differently, we've passed my first building council, was passed in September of last year to have transparency and accountability around the police contract process. And it actually played itself out this year where the administration had to come before council to talk about their proposal for the Fraternal Order of Police. And we actually had over 100 witnesses to testify publicly about their concerns around the impending process. We put a report together and submitted that to the administration for their consideration around their negotiation with the Fraternal Order of Police. And that has never happened in the history of the city of Philadelphia ever, to have that level of transparency and accountability before the city could enter its proposal to the exchange. So we have that understanding committee now that the bill is passed. So every time before the city goes into those negotiations, we must have a hearing and hear from our citizens about their input for the process. So those are the type of things that we're trying to do to be innovative and different and bring new thoughtful ideas and approaches to the public policy process in Philadelphia. And I'm looking forward to continuing to do that type of work as we move forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Councilwoman. I really appreciate your perspective, and we'll see you again down the road. Jill, you should know as background that Philadelphia has a particularly odious Fraternal Order of Police. I mean, embarrassing, and for all the talk of police reform, what we really need is police union reform. And again, it's a millennial on city council that sort of had the temerity to raise that point. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience. But before I do, let me just ask you, I meant to begin with this, something a little personal. How did you become this person? How are you, where did this book come from in you?
Yeah, I mean, so the book itself, the original genesis was from a CNN article. I'm a columnist there, a column that I had written about the OK Boomer meme and the sort of misunderstandings and tensions between boomers and millennials. But as I was writing the book, it was striking to me, how so much of my life kind of reflected these generational trends, right? So, I look at both of my parents. Who my father is the children of immigrants from Europe. My mom is one immigrant parent. Both of them were, the first generation in their families to go to college. Both of them, had this kind of walking up into the middle class, right? Coming from much harder Scrabble backgrounds, certainly than I came from. They did all the sort of boomer things you're supposed to do. Went to college. My dad went to law school. They got married. They had 2 kids and a golden retriever, and they bought a house. By the time they were my age, it was like all of those pieces of adult life were in order. I look around at what my life was like at 30, which is about how old my mom was when she had me. And it was like, I am lucky if I have a retirement account, right? And there's like $20 in it. I like that kind of stability, the idea of owning a house, of getting married, of having kids, all for me at 30 felt very far off, despite having a law degree, right? I also had 6-figure student loan debt. My life just looked a lot different. And now, even I'm 37, I am married, but all those other kind of pieces of an adult life, there's still these outstanding question marks, which is just not at all what things were like for my parents. On the flip side, I've had a life where I've been able to travel. I've been able to pursue a job that I really love. I've, had, I think, a greater degree of freedom than either of my parents had, which I think is also a millennial story. But, part of that freedom has come from the realization that stability seems almost impossible. And so I may as well live a life that I like if I'm not going to be able to live a life that's stable.
That's great. And the boomer in me thinks your parents are awesome, and it sounds like I'd want to hang out with them. Let's go to Ann Gemmel. Ann, one of the most thoughtful Philadelphians we know, joining us again. Hi, Ann. Are you unmuted?
Oh, there I go. Okay.
Yeah.
You're on mute. That's the phrase of the year, right? Still.
Right.
Jill, great listening. I love this. It's really such an interesting topic, and it hits home for me. I'm Gen X. I'm married to a boomer. My kids are Gen Z. We have all these discussions all the time. So it's really awesome. And I was curious thinking about, you know, millennials that I know and respect. I love a lot of them, of course. And thinking about some of the topics that you've talked about. You know, I was pushing a stroller with a 2-year-old when 911 happened, and profound for my life and for their lives. But I also heard a lot of what you said about the economic issues, right? Like that you'll never build wealth the way that your parents or even my generation will. And I've looked at this and thought about it, and I've come to the conclusion that a major obstacle might be identity politics, that this focus on how different we all are might prevent, you know, a cross-generational movement for change in US policies to support more families or to redistribute wealth better. And so I would be curious your thoughts about, you know, or research that you've seen. Is there a generational preference for identity politics across, you know, different ages, and your thoughts about whether or not it impacts our ability to make progress on economic and family-friendly policies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm really glad you raised this idea of identity and identity politics and what that means. You know, I think one of the reasons that we see what we all are currently calling identity politics rising among millennials is that we are a generation that is much more racially diverse than boomers, right? When boomers were coming into the world, their generation was something like 80%, more than 80% white. Millennials are kind of just over half white, right? So our collective identity is not nearly as racially homogenous as the boomer identity. I think part of what sometimes gets missed in the identity politics conversation is that, from my vantage point, that sort of white boomer identity is a much more politically salient identity than what you see from millennials, right? You do see whites voting as a pretty solid block. And they tend to vote for Republicans, especially white men. When you look at the base of the Republican Party, it's overwhelmingly white, right? When you look at who votes for Democrats, it's a much more racially diverse group. And so I think some of the discourse that you see on the left that gets talked about as divisive is actually, from my vantage point, kind of more reflective of who we actually are. So I do think when we're talking about identity politics, it is sometimes worth thinking through, well, you know, why is it that talking about multiple identities is more divisive than assuming that everybody in the room is white, which is kind of how boomer politics have historically worked. You know, I think that there's some really interesting political science coming out right now about, you know, what works better if we talk about policies as race neutral, or if we talk about the racial implications of those policies. And what that work is finding is that if you don't talk about the racial implications of the policies, if you talk about them in race neutral terms, you get more white support, right? Which to me is not super surprising. So as kind of an immediate political means to an end, there's certainly an argument that that makes more sense. I'm not a politician running for office. You know, I'm a journalist and a writer and a cultural commentator. And so for me, the important thing is not necessarily what's the most politically expedient, but what's the most true. What's the most honest way of talking about this? What's the most nuanced and layered way? And I don't think you can talk about this stuff without, I don't think you can talk about political policy without talking about the racial component of it in a country that we still see very, very different outcomes based on race, that has a long history of law and policy being made to serve some racial groups and disadvantage others, right? So I think there is a tension there. But I also think, perhaps politicians and folks like me play slightly different roles, and it's okay for that to be a little bit tense and messy as we sort it out and have these conversations. But I think we have to have them kind of as honestly, as robustly, and with as much nuance as possible, which I
Mhm.
think requires talking about race.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree. Thanks for having me up, Larry. A little
Thanks, man.
surprised. Thank you.
Great question, and it actually has me thinking. Uh, I'm very practical about this stuff, right? And if you want change, what's the best way to get change? And it's actually, it seems to me that the um, the most effective poverty fighting programs have been universal, not targeted towards a specific group or not, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And so uh, and the experiments that we're seeing now with UBI is also universal. And so I wonder if that's a sort of way to still talk about, just to still target racial outcomes, but couch it in universal communitarian language.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a really brilliant thinker, writer, policy wonk named Heather McGhee who just wrote a whole book on this topic. You should have her on. Her book is one of the most interesting things that I think has come out in the past year. I believe she's now starting a podcast on like the Obama's podcast network. So I think you're going to be seeing and hearing from her. But she essentially makes like the both and argument, right? That yes, policies should be inclusive and available to everyone. That's sort of the best way to do this, right? To make our policies universal. But when you're talking about what the policies are, how they're targeted, how they're written, if you don't look at racial differences, if you don't look at gender differences, if it's a bunch of white men in a room looking at their own lives and thinking in their own communities and going from there, you're going to miss a lot. And those policies won't, in practice, be universal. I think we can and have to do both.
Yeah, great point. Back in the 50s, when Eisenhower was president and all those white dudes in black and white photos divvied up the American cities with highways going through them, they might not have meant to create ghettos, but they did. And it was a result of who's in the room and who's not.
Right, exactly. And same with a lot of FDR New Deal policies, right? Which excluded domestic workers, overwhelmingly excluded female workers, and excluded a lot of workers of color. Was that explicitly by design? Some of it was, yeah. And was some of it just kind of by omission, by who was in the room and what their assumptions were? Yeah, that was part of it too.
I see we're joined by Tanya. Hi, Tanya. Welcome.
Hi, Larry. Thanks for including me. My question is actually very short too, but it is about millennials and about how we're just completely missed. We're not discussed. I feel like millennials are discussed and boomers are discussed. And I totally appreciate what you're saying about who has power in our country. It is definitely the boomers. The recession for, I would say, Gen X is that we were at a particular age where people younger than us coming right out of school could take jobs at lower salaries than we were willing to take them. And we already had established financial obligations like homes and things like that. So it, it was a real struggle. And we didn't have anything against millennials. I don't feel like that was a thing. But we're just like not in any conversation. And yet we exist. I mean, the people that I work on city change with are mostly millennials. I mean, I'm sorry, mostly Gen Xers. And our work has been in activism, in, planning and things like that, often because we don't have planning jobs because we couldn't get them. The younger generations got them. So I'm happy to do this as a volunteer, but I'm just saying that was one of the outcomes for me of something that happened. And I'm just curious about that.
So that's why Gen Xers totally ignored.
Who?
Yeah, exactly. I like to joke that Gen Xers are like the Jan Brady generation, right? It's like Marsha, the obsession with millennials. And whenever I do one of these events, there's 100% of the time a Gen Xer being like, "We are here," which I totally hear. I think that one of the reasons Gen Xers get a bit glossed over is they're a much smaller generation. There's far, far fewer Gen Xers than there are either millennials or boomers, right? Boomers were the largest generation in American history, and sometime around 2016, millennials overtook them. There was never a point where Gen Xers were dominant numerically, which means that I think the Gen Xer influence on politics and culture has been certainly less robust than the boomer influence, who have like shaped everything their entire way through. But that said, I think you're absolutely right that, and the numbers show that you're right, that Gen Xers were hit very badly by the 2008 recession. That it was Gen Xers, who were, I think, the most likely or among the most likely to lose their homes, to not be, get their homes foreclosed upon, to not be able to pay their mortgages, to lose jobs, to see their incomes just absolutely go off a cliff. At least from what I've seen from the recovery data is that yes, Gen Xers probably did not land back where they would have been, but they got a lot closer to it than millennials did. And so I think that's where some of the gap comes in. But that said, generations don't have hard lines, right? It's not like someone who was born in 1979 is doing great and somebody who was born in 1981 is, their whole life is a disaster. It's not how it works. These things are a slow slide, sometimes a quick slide. And so, Gen Xers is this kind of bridge generation between boomers and millennials, where in a lot of ways, I think the canaries in the coal mine for what millennials were staring down. But I'm not sure we quite recognize the degree to which Gen Xers were being hurt by, for example, Reagan era political policies. That if we had paid attention and if we had made some changes when Gen Xers were young, I think millennials would be in a really, really different position now. And it's frustrating to see this repeat itself, right? That we're still not making the kind of necessary changes as Gen Zers are now the ones graduating from college and entering adulthood, and frankly, are being set up to do even worse than millennials.
Tanya, thank you so much for that question and for joining us.
Thank you.
Jill, this has been terrific. And I want to close with, at the end of the book, you have a line that really moved me. And it's in the context of you're making a sort of plea to both sides of this generational divide for mutual understanding. And the line was, boomers look at what they might lose if things change. Millennials look at what we will lose if things don't, which I think is such a great way to capsulize the issue. How do we move forward in the age of the 140 character soundbite to mutual understanding, as you urge at the end of the book?
It's a great question. And I'll kind of circle back to the mostly obnoxious but nugget of truth Bill Maher monologue. He's right that experience does not always beget wisdom, right? I mean, I think Donald Trump is a good example of you can be old and still quite ignorant, but experience often begets wisdom. And I think millennials certainly have a lot to learn from boomers. I think one of the things that to me is always really striking is that I think when we think about, old wise people, right? The people that come to mind are quite old or dead. Boomers are still the leaders of many of our most vibrant social movements, right? People like Bryan Stevenson. People like Dan Savage, who's a sex columnist, is a boomer, right? So the boomers are a generation that is still they're quite active. They're a part of many of the movements for racial justice, for gender equality, for LGBT rights. A lot of the folks at Stonewall were boomers, right? have been many of the most active participants in these movements for decades. And so I think the millennials who very, very much care about these issues, which is a majority of us, certainly have a lot to learn from boomers who have been around the block a few times, right? And I think we are learning from them. I think a lot of us are working in concert with baby boomers. We maybe just don't always recognize them as such. So, I think that's one way that on our part, we could do a little bit better about understanding that boomers are a diverse generation. They're not all, reactionary Trumpist conservatives, and that already these connections exist and could certainly be fostered and made stronger. And we could talk about the boomer generation with a little more nuance. From the boomer side, one thing I would love to see is more power sharing, right? I think boomers, and they're lucky for this, have for most of their lives been dominant from the time they were young until now. Biggest generation in American history until very recently. And boomers, I don't think anybody is saying that boomers should just be put out to pasture with their old age, right? I don't want to see all boomers like immediately retire and go away. What I would like to see is boomers inviting younger folks and not so young folks like the millennials who are in their 40s at this point, to the power sharing table, not just as like, here's my young friend, who I'm going to kind of prop up here, but really as equal players and, mentoring us to be able to take this thing over very soon. I think we're seeing some of that shift in politics, but frankly, not quickly enough. We're not seeing the level of investment in young people that we should. I don't think we're seeing it quickly enough in our various institutions, be they professional or cultural. And so that's why I'd love to see boomers really sort of make a pretty significant shift here, which is saying, you know what, I've had a lot of power, I have a lot of resources, I'm going to start ceding some of that to the young people that need to be able to take the reins.
We had an example of that here a few years ago where my friend Zach Stolberg in his 60s, he was the longtime editor of the Philadelphia Daily News and then headed Committee of 70, a political reform group, and announced that he was retiring. And he went off to Santa Fe to ride horses. But his statement was wonderful because it was, and I'll paraphrase it, it was, I hope the rest of Philadelphia's permanent establishment pays attention and similarly rides off into the sunset on a horse so that others can lead. And I thought it was beautiful. Sadly, it kind of went unheeded. It was advice that kind of went unheeded, but you're going to change all that with your book. So thank you so much, Jill. I can't thank you enough. This is such a thoughtful, smart, well-written book. I hope everyone buys it. And we look forward to having you back at some point when the world comes back. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. Everyone who tuned in, I appreciate it. And especially the Philadelphia Citizen, you all are doing really incredible, important work. So it's been a real thrill to be here. Also very happy you're partnering with an independent bookstore. So you don't have to buy my book, buy some book. Independent small bookstores, they need our support more than ever. So whatever book it is, go on their website, buy something if you can afford it. Thank you so much.